Rental properties begin like a startup company. So like the Silicon Valley startup company where you're having to be all in and put a lot of time and effort in, but they end up like a blue chip stock. You spend 1 or 2 hours per week on it. It pays your bills. It grows in wealth. That's the reality of rental properties. Welcome to the podcast, Real Estate Investing with Coach Carson. I'm your host, Chad Carson. You can also call me Coach, and this is a show to help you get out of the financial grind so you can do more of what matters. To everyone listening in the United States, happy 4th of July, and happy July to everyone. The topic of this episode is rental properties are passive enough. So this is going to be a solo episode. I'm not doing an interview today, and I'm continuing this series of episodes where I'm talking about topics in my book, The Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor, which I'm excited to say will be publishing later this month, July the 20th, on Bigger Pockets. If you're on my newsletter list, which I hope you are, you can go to coachcarson.com/newsletter. I'll be announcing some pre-order bonuses. So if you order the book ahead of time, you get some pretty cool bonuses, including a giveaway, some drawings, chance to win some one-on-one coaching with me, some other really cool stuff. So check that out. But the purpose of this episode is one of the biggest objections I get. And I'm trying to think about if you're interested in real estate investing, if you're already a rental investor, maybe this isn't an objection for you, but people who are on the fence, if I read online forums, if I read the YouTube comments, one of the most common objections is, yeah, rental investing is great. You can become a millionaire. I know that. I'm not arguing that. And rental investing can produce cash flow. Let's just give you that. But rental property investing is not passive. Let's say I don't want to have to deal with another job. I don't want to have to deal with tenants in the middle of the night or having, a toilet overflowing in the middle of the night. It's just not passive enough. Therefore, it's not a good enough investment. If I had $1 for every time I read that objection online or heard it from someone, I would be a millionaire without investing in rental properties. And so the problem with it, and the reason I want to tackle it in today's episode, is it's a sort of myth. Now, it's not that real estate investing, rental property investing doesn't have some work to it. I'm going to talk about what that is and how it's often front-loaded when you buy a property. The problem with the myth is that rental property investing can be very passive. In fact, it can be passive enough to do everything you want to do in terms of your financial goals. So I'm going to share with you my experience. I've been investing in real estate for 21 years now and been doing rental property investing for most of that time. And so I can only give you my perspective, but I want to share my own experience and tell you how passive rental property investing actually is, when it becomes more passive, when it's not passive, and then give you some tips and some approaches that you can use to make your own rental property investing more passive. So I want to start this conversation, this episode, looking at the question we usually ask ourselves about rental properties being passive. So the question I usually hear is, are rental properties passive? So I think we're asking the wrong question. The question should really be, how passive are rental properties? Or how passive are rental properties compared to other options? Because the reality is nothing is 100% passive. That's a real myth. Even a CD in the bank, you put money in the bank and they pay you interest, seems like one of the most passive investments you could have. But every 6 months, you have to renew it. You got to choose whether you want to go with this CD or another CD. Yes, it might be a small amount of time, but there's always a certain amount of mental energy you have to put into any money management you're doing, any investing. And so the question is really, where on the spectrum of this passive income investment universe is this investment we're looking at, our rental properties? And the question I want to explore this more helpful is, how passive are rental properties compared to other things, compared to, for example, you working a job? I actually think this is the most relevant question. So if we're investing in real estate to get out of the financial grind, to replace our job income one of these days, might be 5 years from now if you're really ambitious, it might be 20, 30 years from now. But the goal is to have these investments paying you income or building wealth that you can use that wealth to support yourself without you having to go to that 9-to-5 job working for somebody else, maybe working for yourself. And so let's look at, are rental properties more passive than your job? And based on any study, any data that I've looked at online, the Bureau of Labor Statistics collected by the United States government, The average job in the United States works about 37 to 40 hours per week. It really depends on whether you're part-time, whether you're full-time, but all of you know, you know your jobs pretty well. You know that you work this 40-hour week or more, often much more, especially when you count the commute, when you count getting ready in the morning, when you count the extra work you have to do at home that you take home with you. Just hold that in your mind, how much time you spend working a job. And now let's compare that to your potential time that you would work owning rental properties. Now I'm going to talk to you about how much time you spend up front on rental properties, because there's a difference between when you start rental properties and when you end them. But I want to give you the ultimate destination. The rental property business that I'm in now is more of a stabilized rental property portfolio. So I've been living in Spain, in Granada, Spain with my family for the last year. And on average, I don't track this every single week, but I know that I spend at least 2 hours or less on rental property investing every week. I know this because I spend a lot of time on other stuff, like taking Spanish classes, like working on my Coach Carson stuff, writing a book, recording podcast episodes, going out and hiking with friends here in the area, doing activities with my kids. So a majority of my time is spent on other stuff. And then I usually give myself one morning a week to have some quiet, kind of deep work time, doing some bookkeeping, doing some organization. And then throughout the week, I'll get little text here and there, not every day, but every once in a while from my property manager saying, hey, we have to spend $900 on a refrigerator. That's more than the $500 you've allowed us to make decisions on. So anything below $500, I just let them make a decision and I'll look at it later. And so very rarely do I get communication from them, but that happens every once in a while. And so 2 hours per week or less. Some weeks it might be 10 minutes. Other weeks it might be 3 or 4 hours, like if we're preparing taxes or doing something more. But the point is, let's compare those two. 2 hours per week versus 40, 50, 60 hours per week working a regular job. So is rental property investing completely passive? No, I'm spending a couple hours per week. But is that passive enough to do everything else that I'm wanting to do in my life? Absolutely. And that's the more important question. Now you might think this is just a Chad thing. Yeah, you're lucky. Maybe you have some different rental properties. Maybe you've just been really good at setting up systems. And so it's just not replicatable. But I've made a habit of asking other real estate investors, especially when I'm doing these interviews with people, and I'm starting to do it every single time, saying, how much time do you spend on your stabilized rental properties? Now, not the time when you buy the rental property and you're having to do a remodel project. That's, again, what I'm going to talk about a little bit later, the front loading, the more work you do on the front end of a rental property. What I'm talking about is after you own them, after you have a tenant, after they're in there paying rent, and just the normal maintenance mode of your rental properties. How much time are people spending? I'll give you one example, an interview I did recently with Michael Zuber. He wrote the book, One Rental at a Time. He immediately said 4 to 6 hours per month, something like that. So again, 1 to 1.5 hours per week on average is what he spends on his existing rental properties. I interviewed another couple, Karen and Bob. They're students of mine and they've moved to Portugal now, and they have properties in South Carolina and the United States. And they also said about 4 hours per month is what they spend doing bookkeeping, and they also have some communication with their property manager. But I'm consistently, when I'm asking people, I'm getting this 4 to 6 hours per month figure for a wide variety of people managing 5, 10 properties. I'm more in the little bit larger camp where we have a couple property managers and we have 100 units between me and my business partner. So we're kind of on the larger end of the small and mighty real estate investor. And people like Michael Zuber have probably about the same as mine, maybe a little bit more. And then everything in between. And my point is, look at the job you're doing right now, compare it to the way that could be with rental properties and the stable phase of rental properties, and just ask yourself, is that passive enough for you compared to the job, especially if you can get to the point, which is the whole goal of my book, The Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor, to help you get to the point where the rental properties are paying for your bills. Maybe they're paying for your kind of basic bills, your lean FI bills, your necessary expenses in your life, your mortgage, your health insurance, the food, just those basics. To know that your rental properties are covering that with a couple hours per week is an amazing feeling. And then as you continue growing and you get a little bit more income coming in and you have all of your regular expenses paid for. So not only your necessities, but a little bit of luxuries and going out to eat, paying for kids' activities or paying for a little bit of travel. That's kind of what I call normal FI. And then you can even grow even more, which has been the goal for my wife and I and my business partner. We are trying to get to more of a fat FI stage where pick, your normal expenses add in some luxuries, add in some travel, add in a cushion for inflation, for other things you're worried about. So the point is, having a cushion at FatFi means your rental properties are paying for the larger amount of expenses. So for example, maybe you spend $80,000, $90,000 per year, but maybe you have $120,000 per year as your goal from your rental income, and that would be more of like a FatFi goal. And the whole point here, though, is can you accomplish all of that with just 2 to 4 hours per week, or 2 hours per week, 4 to 6 hours per month? Yes, it's possible. There are rental property investors out there doing that. Yes, it's going to require some systemization. Yes, you're going to have to build a little bit of a team behind you. Property managers are the big team member for me. But the point I want to make to you is that is possible, and compare that to what you're doing with your job. So the last thing I want to say about your job versus rental properties is think about the type of problems you have at your job, and think about the type of problems you have heard about or people object to with rental properties. So I mentioned at the very beginning of the episode, people complain about, well, I'm going to get a tenant call about a toilet overflowing, or I'm going to get, a tenant move out and now we're going to have to release that thing. So yes, those are issues. And if you've never owned a rental property before, maybe that feels a little stressful, like, oh man, I don't know when I have to deal with that, compared to a stock index fund or something. That's just a problem I wouldn't have to deal with, which is true. But if you compare that to the types of problems, the types of stressors, the types of things you have to deal with that are outside of your control at a job. And so just imagine that whatever your job is, I'm 100% sure there are problems you have there as well. And what I'll say about the rental property problems is not that they're not problems, it's just that they're pretty easy to solve. I have very few. I can think about on one hand over a 21-year period with over 100 units, self-managing a lot of those for many years, where I had problems that were just where I had to drop the phone, let's go take care of this thing. For example, we had a fire in a property a few years ago, and I was just worried about, are the tenants okay? What's going on? Drop it right now. Let's go look at the property. I happened to be in town at that point. If I had a property manager, and my property manager actually handled most of the details. We've had it one other time I can think about early in my career where we had a hot water heater go out and the water ran all over the floor in the living room, and it was an elderly tenant who didn't have any family nearby, so we had to go and just kind of help her deal with some things that evening. So on one hand, I can think of that's happened with many units for many years. But in the reality is these days, I had one of the worst problems we've had in a few years, a septic tank. We usually have sewer at our rental properties. We had a septic tank go bad at a property, which is not a good problem. The sewer backs up in the bathroom. It's very inconvenient and troublesome for the tenant. I had to deal with that, but the way I dealt with that was text and emails and approving them spending money. That's pretty much what you have to do when you have other people managing it for you. So you can have property managers handling the front end of a lot of problems. And so I just want to emphasize that the time of your spent on rental properties versus a job, there's a big difference there. And the problems and the way you have to deal with them, there's a big difference as well. Yes, there's going to be some problems, but can you hire people to help you deal with those and take kind of the sting of those problems out? Do you have to answer calls in the middle of the night? You don't have to do that. You can even empower your tenants. I have some self-managed properties where we have a list of the plumber, the heating and air person, and the instructions are, if you have an emergency with a plumber that requires plumbing, call this plumber. They're 24-hour service. They'll come out and help you. Yes, I'd like to know about it. Send me a text, but I'm not going to necessarily have to wake up in the middle of the night to deal with that. There are things that happen when you're living in a house. You educate your tenants about that. They can help you handle that. And yes, you'll pay the bill, but are you going to have to get up in the middle of the night and deal with that? Not necessarily. So a lot of that is just overblown. And I just want to give you some of the perspective of thinking about your decision to invest in rental properties and trying to be realistic about that and always comparing it to what the alternative is. So I want to continue with this idea of comparing rental properties to other alternatives. So how passive are they compared to something else? So we talked about a job, and that's the main one I want you to think about. But I also want to compare owning rental properties to owning a business. So some of you might not be in a job situation. Maybe you want to start your own business. And I've definitely been there. I've started several businesses, a couple of them in the real estate investing world, flipping houses, managing properties, mainly for ourselves. I don't do either one of those very much anymore. I'm mainly just in the rental investment business. I also have the Coach Carson business, which kind of started by accident as an education business, an online media business. So I have experience with businesses, and a lot of us get into business. And I love entrepreneurship. I'm a huge, huge fan, It's, I think, one of the most important skills we can all learn these days, because we have to have our own job security and flexibility to be able to help people, to serve people, and to do it through a business entity. So I love it. Love the business idea. But again, I want to compare how passive rental properties are to owning a business. And my experience, and also reading studies online about how much time your average business owner spends, they're typically spending a lot more time than somebody who's in the same position at a job. So when you own the business, you not only have to do the thing, but you have to manage the other people on your team doing the thing. And then at night, you have to do the bookkeeping, and you have to do the cleaning up of the store, or whatever the case might be. The point is, when you own a business, there is not a set number of hours you have to spend. And it's very easy to spend 40 hours per week if you're doing this full time, more like 60 hours per week. When I was flipping houses early in my career, it was more like 60 to 80 hours per week, flipping houses, finding deals, managing properties, doing all of that early in my career. And that was just a normal thing for me as a 20 to 30 something year old new entrepreneur. The interesting thing is, though, a lot of us get into business for the freedom that we want to get from it. And there is some flexibility there. You're setting your own schedule, although you still have to do a lot of things, but you are getting into the business because you want to control your own destiny. And the end goal of business, which I do think is possible, is that eventually you want to work your way out of a lot of the details you don't like to do. And maybe you enjoy parts of it and you want to keep doing that for the rest of your life. But there are ways to systematize a business. There are ways to hire other people to do different parts of the business for you. So if you owned a store, you can hire people to work the cashier for you. Or if you own a landscaping business, you can hire other people to run the equipment for you. And you can go out and get you can move from a doing it role to a sales role. Maybe you go out and get new business for your landscaping business. And then eventually maybe you hire a salesperson to do that too. And you're just the owner who manages all these people within your business. So all of that is possible, and I'm not going to say owning a business that turns passive isn't possible, but it's much more difficult to manage 10 people than it is to manage 10 tenants. Let me say that again. It's much more difficult to manage 10 employees or team members than it is to manage 10 rental properties. 10 tenants who live in a rental property, piece of cake. They often, if you buy the right houses, the right types of properties, owning 10 properties, even self-managing them, can be a very, very part-time venture. You can empower them to do a lot of things because typically this is their house. They live there, they pay their rent. Every once in a while there might be an issue, but as I said, you can empower them to call plumbers, to do things. One of my mentors, John Schaub, owns about 25, 30 single-family houses in Sarasota, Florida. He self-manages those properties and travels all the time, always has time to do all sorts of stuff, and spends some time on his rental properties, but probably in the same realm of the amount of time that I spend on mine. So the point is, when you own a business, rental properties are a business when you first start. And so I don't want to sugarcoat the fact that you might have to spend more time on the front end learning the business, studying it. You're going to have to spend time finding properties. You're going to have to spend time talking to private lenders, talking to banks, getting the financing. So there is an upfront, you could call it like a down payment of effort that you have to put into rental properties and getting into the business. But once you own them, it's much easier to systematize, to outsource a lot of the tasks that you have to do managing properties than it is with other businesses. In almost every town that you can find rental properties in, there'll be property management companies there to help you do that. In almost every single town you could buy rental properties, there are going to be contractors, repair contractors who can do a lot of the work for you. There's cleaning services who can clean properties for you. And so there's really a built-up system to help you become more passive as a rental property investor. And a lot of what I talk in the book, I actually have a whole chapter on systemization, operations, how to build your business such that it runs on its own instead of you having to do every single thing in your business. So if you're interested in that idea, that's going to be a big topic in the book. But the whole point, again, of this episode is helping you make a decision to be all in on rental properties or not. You can choose whichever route you want to go. But if you're on the fence saying rental properties aren't passive enough, comparing them to a job, comparing them to a business, rental properties are a very passive vehicle that has a lot of benefits. So I want to move to probably the most important comparison we're going to make. You might give me, yeah, Chad, rental properties are more passive than my job. And yes, Chad, of course, rental properties are easier to make passive than a business. Yeah, but what about owning index funds, owning stocks and bonds, and just buying an index fund that owns a big basket of stocks and bonds. If you've never heard of that, that's kind of the preferred vehicle for a lot of small investors, including myself. I like investing in stock index funds on the side as well, in addition to real estate. But the point is, you might say, Chad, you're trying to convince me here that rentals are passive, but you can't tell me that rentals are more passive than owning an index fund of stocks. Seems to be one of the easiest things you can do. You press a button, you buy the index fund every year. All the owners of those companies do their thing, and they're not asking you for maintenance calls. They're not asking you to lease a property. Pretty passive, right? And my response to you as someone who owns rental properties and index funds is absolutely, you're right. Index funds are more passive than owning a rental property. If I spend 2 hours per week on my rental properties, I probably spend 1 minute thinking about my index funds, or maybe less on a week-to-week basis. And of course, once a year or maybe once a quarter, I am looking at rebalancing a little bit or buying more stocks, or I'm reading up on some news a little bit, but it's a much more passive venture, at least in my case. But, and there's a big but here, that's not the whole story about whether you should choose to invest in rentals, or at least prioritizing investing in rentals. It doesn't have to be an either or thing, but often you have to decide, like, what's going to be my core vehicle? Am I going to make real estate investing my core financial independence vehicle, or am I going to make stock investing, index funds my core vehicle? There really is a fork in the road. And I have found that the main fork in the road, the main decision tree for yourself about which way to go, is about control. Because here's the thing, the more passive an investment is, by definition, that means you have less control over that investment. So although you own an index fund with a lot of stocks and they're not going to be calling you, asking you for anything, at the same time, you have no control over whether those businesses succeed. And you might say, well, that's a good thing. I'm okay with that. But you have to know your personality here. And here's where the fork in the road really happens. For many of us, when you own index funds and that's your main way of building wealth, and maybe you're getting closer and closer to the time when you have to live off of your investments, it can be extremely stressful. There's just something about our animal brain that is used to being in control, is used to being able to do something when something goes wrong. And when you have a stock market that dips down and maybe it drops by 20% or 30% or 40%, you being able to sit on your hands and do nothing and have no control and just let it ride is a very difficult exercise, especially when your lifestyle, when your early retirement, when paying for the bills is depending on that. So yes, in theory, a lot of people say, well, I'm going to hold on. I know I'm an investor for the long run. That's what I want to do. That's the theory of what most people say. But if you read studies on what mutual fund, index fund investors actually do, they sell at the wrong time once the index funds or the stocks have gone down in value, and then they buy in at the wrong time once the index funds have gone back up. They try to time the market, and most of the reason they're doing that are emotions. They can't sit on their hands. They're stressed about it. They want to do something. We're used to being able to do something to influence a problem that's happening and to make it right and to make it better. When you own passive investments, what's the only thing you can do? You can press a button to buy, you can press a button to sell, and the whole story here, and I'm not saying that doesn't mean they're not passive. What I'm saying is there's always a trade-off. So the more passive it is, the less control you have. And you have to know yourself, is that something I'm going to be comfortable with? Is that something I can sleep well at night? Am I okay making the core part of my portfolio that I'm going to use to achieve financial independence that vehicle? And so for many people who tend to be on a little bit more of the control freak side, I'll put myself in that camp as well. We say, no, I think I'd rather have something that has a little bit more entrepreneurship. It has something that I can influence a little bit more. I can get in there and affect the problem and fix it and help solve it. But then it's still passive enough. That is rental property definition in my book. Rental properties are something where the work and the effort, as I mentioned earlier, is front-loaded. So most of the most important work you do as a rental property investor is choosing the right location, it's choosing the right property, it's fixing it up well in the first place so that you can attract the right tenants who want to stay there and stay there for a long time and pay on time. So the key word here is the work is front-loaded. And then when problems do happen, when you have a tenant who is upset because your septic system you went out and now you're having a problem there, you can have a conversation with that tenant. You can offer to give them a credit on rent. You can deal with problems when needed, or your property manager can deal with some of those problems to make a bad situation better. And so not only is there something psychologically satisfying about that, but it can also be very profitable. One of the most important lessons I've ever learned in real estate investing is that you make money by solving problems. So every time you buy a property from someone who has a problem, maybe they inherited this house and it needs a lot of work, maybe they're about to be behind on their payments, maybe two people divorce and they just want to get rid of the property and just move on. There are all sorts of life situations that happen, and you as a real estate investor can buy properties and help people solve those problems. So if you kind of turn that problem mentality around to say that's actually an opportunity in disguise, it takes this idea of real estate investing not being completely passive, makes it more of a benefit instead of a negative. So just remember this quote. I have found that rental properties begin like a startup company. So like the Silicon Valley startup company where you're having to be all in and put a lot of time and effort in, but they end up like a blue chip stock, something that's very mature, very stable. Your rent comes in month after month. So in that fork in the road decision I'm talking about here, are you going to invest in index funds and make that your main thing? Are you going to invest in rental properties and make that your main thing? Are you okay with that dynamic? Are you okay with starting with a startup company and having to do that on the front end? And then 5 or 10 years later, having this blue chip stock like investment, you spend 1 or 2 hours per week on it. It pays your bills. It grows in wealth. That's the reality of rental properties. So I want to bring this whole conversation back to you. At the beginning of every episode, I say that the purpose of the show, the mission of Coach Carson, is to help you get out of the financial grind so you can do more of what matters. And that do what matters part of the motto is really the most important thing. That's why we're here investing in real estate. That's the point of whether an investment is passive or not. And so I just want to offer you the question, are rental properties passive enough? Think about what it is you want to do in your life. Maybe you're working a full-time job now and you'd like to go part-time. Maybe you're married or you have a partner and one of you wants to stay home with the kids and the other one's going to keep working. That's what matters to you at this phase in your life. Or maybe you just want to retire completely and you want to do other things. You want to do hobbies that don't pay you any money. Maybe you want to contribute to your community. I do a lot of volunteering in my community. My wife and I helped start with other friends in our hometown, a nonprofit that's trying to build a network of walking and biking trails around our community of Clemson, South Carolina. I've spent literally 10 to 20 hours per week for many, many years with zero pay, no expectation, no desire to make any money from that, but I've had the time to do that. So what matters to you? That's the starting point. That's the mission here at Coach Carson. That's the point of the Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor book, which I hope you'll get pretty soon. I talk a lot about that in the beginning, how that's the point of real estate investing, not having 1,000 units and having the most properties and being able to impress everybody on Instagram. That's not the point. The point is you knowing you're successful because you're doing what matters on a consistent basis, that your time, the most valuable asset, your time is spent on what matters to you. And so my message today with how passive are rental properties is, are they passive enough for you to do those things? And so start with that, work it backwards and say, I would really love to do this. And I want rental properties to help me pay the bills, maybe in part, maybe, the normal FI kind of level where you pay your regular expenses, or maybe you want to be all in like I am and have rental properties pay for 100% of your lifestyle, having a fat FI lifestyle where you can travel, you can do a lot of fun stuff. It doesn't happen overnight, but eventually you can get there and you have to be diligent with it. You have to be committed to it. And that's really what this episode's been about, is taking away that objection saying, I'm not sure if rental properties are passive enough. They're passive enough. You have to do some work to make that happen. You got to build some systems. You got to build a team. But that's why this podcast is here. That's why my Coach Carson platform's here. The courses I teach, the book I write is really about giving you those skills and helping training you to be a small and mighty investor who can succeed, who can have these rental properties that support your lifestyle. You spend more time doing what matters. That's what makes me excited. I love getting letters from you. I love getting emails. I love getting comments on YouTube. So let me know if that idea resonates with you. Let me know what matters to you, what you're working on. Also, let me know, those of you who are more experienced rental investors, remember I say I like asking other investors, how much time do you spend on average on your rental properties? The stable, mature rental properties that are already having tenants, that are good to go. How much time are you spending on those on a month-to-month basis? Let me know in the comments of the YouTube video. We'll have a little crowd-funded answer to this question so that you don't just think it's just me telling you this. I want all of you who are thinking about rental property investing to see these other investors as well. As always, I want to thank you for being here and for listening to the episode or watching it on YouTube. And I want to encourage you to come back next week. I've got a great episode. It's with a longtime friend of mine, somebody I actually went to high school with, who has a story about helping his family, his legacy, his mom and dad get out of a tough situation where they were actually facing bankruptcy. He graduated from college and came back, and they had rental properties with a lot of debt. There was just some problems going on. They together as a family worked on that and were able to get out of that situation, and now are thriving and have rental properties that are supporting his parents. So I love this story. Talking about do what matters. Not only are you trying to make yourself money and build wealth for yourself, but what about your family, and about passing this on to other people and using real estate investing to make your family a better place, to help each other. That's what that episode's all about. You're going to love it. I hope you'll join me for that. And if you haven't subscribed yet to the newsletter, go to coachcarson.com/newsletter. Every week I provide tips, provide ideas, and links to other things that are going on with me behind the scenes. So I think you'll enjoy that if you want to stay in touch with me after the podcast. Hope you have a great week, and I'll see you soon.